two cases to unravel for you here tonight, and you're in the right place. Got one in Manhattan, got one in Atlanta. One's a bigger clown show than the other, but they're both clown shows. So let's start with Atlanta. We'll get to some audio later, but let's break it down. First of all, Fani Willis, when she testified, and she went on and she's made it clear that she's a nut. She's a nut. She doesn't have the temperament. She doesn't have the intelligence. She doesn't have the idea of justice at her forethought. And to listen to her boyfriend, Wade, later she said they had a falling out, and he said women are only good to make sandwiches. I don't know. I make sandwiches, don't you, Mr. Producer? I like my sandwiches. You don't make sandwiches better than I do. No way. But I like sandwiches. Anyway, there was that, but she went on and on. Her conduct in the courtroom was a disgrace. The media always trashed Trump and his people. Now, this took the cake. The judge, I think he felt he had to bend over backwards for her, but the truth is, he should have warned her a few times and then eventually warned her that she'll be held in contempt, and then eventually hold her in contempt. Anyway, that's what I would have done. I'm not a judge. But there was a lot here. Most of you work for a living, so you weren't able to watch this. You're not liberal Democrats who sit at home and expect you to subsidize them when they watch TV. Yes, liberal Democrats. A couple of things here, and to me it involves money. Almost all their transactions were in cash. These are two lawyers. The DA, almost all her transactions were in cash. Wade always used his corporate card. Did you hear that, Mr. Producer? And then at the end of the year, he'd meet with his accountants, and they'd figure out what wasn't properly charged as corporate and what was, and they'd figure it out and then file his taxes. Willis basically had a stash of cash. This is a woman on a government payroll, but she said, I was earning a lot. DA, 200, I don't care. Haven't you heard of ATM machines? You need cash, you go to an ATM machine, you get your cash. And I don't know people who have thousands of dollars put away because their daddy told them that that's what a woman should do. Now, I don't believe she's living off the grid, putting cash away, that sort of thing, Mr. Producer, and I get that. No, she's living in Atlanta, Georgia, Fulton County. And then Wade, her lover, he wasn't slick at all. In fact, he sounded like a buffoon. Where'd you get all this cash from, Mr. Wade? Listen, in my practice, a lot of people would come through the door. They needed a lawyer, and they'd bring me cash. They'd pay me in cash. Now, when I was in the private sector, nobody paid me in cash, and you wouldn't want them to pay you in cash, Mr. Producer, because you need to account for every penny. So here we have two people who just coincidentally only use cash, except when Mr. Wade is using his corporate card, Mr. Producer. One of the lawyers was pointing out, but the judge kept interrupting him, that she violated the ethics rules as well. If you take more than $100 in gifts, you need to report it. Well, they went out to dinner a lot. Sometimes Wade paid, sometimes she paid, almost always in cash, Mr. Producer. They went to Belize on a trip. She paid with cash. So they're covering it up because that's just BS. And they didn't want the money traced. Now, if you're in the Internal Revenue Service or the Federal Bureau of Investigation, if you're at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Atlanta, or you're with the Georgia State Tax Agency, you should be opening a criminal investigation right about now. You should be subpoenaing as fast as you possibly can all the bank records. You should be subpoenaing Mr. Wade's records as an attorney from his firm. There are enough red flags here to turn the courtroom into a communist Chinese fort. Everything corporate card, if not, then cash. They reimbursed each other with cash when they decided to reimburse each other. And I think this is why Fani Willis was so nuts today. And I don't know if the judge realizes this. I don't know if anybody in that courtroom realizes this, except some of the good lawyers who were representing the defendants. This, to me, has turned into an IRS, FBI, U.S. Attorney, Georgia State taxpayer or tax agency case. This, in other words, a potential criminal case involving the use and abuse of taxpayer funds, as well as failure to report various uses of cash. And what some of the lawyers were trying to get to was, where'd all this cash come from? And she fought like hell, Fani Willis. She fought like somebody who was guilty. And the lead counsel there for Mike Roman, Marshawn, I believe her name is, she kept trying to dig in, and then eventually she was stopped. I also noticed that the counsel for the state defending the prosecutor and the counsel for Wade, endless objections, endless attorney-client privilege claims. Got to protect attorney-client privilege, due process. It's right there. You don't want to make a mistake. I thought to myself, attorney-client privilege is that important, isn't it, Mr. Producer? And for whom was attorney-client privilege stripped in the January 6th case? Donald Trump. In a secret hearing, the transcript of which has never been released, a secret hearing, they claim crime fraud exception, they can claim whatever they want, the prosecution, and Donald Trump, his lead lawyer in the documents case, was forced to testify in front of the federal grand jury investigating Trump and deliver all his handwritten notes and anything else that was in his possession to the grand jury. Extraordinary. You're talking about a former president who's running for president. Not even talking about the crimes of the century. He's charged with violating the Klan Act. He's charged with obstruction under the Enron Act and the Espionage Act, which is preposterous, particularly when you see how Joe Biden's treated. Now, I'm going to talk about this on Life, Liberty, and Levin on Saturday, but I just want to say this to you. Anybody who tells you now that the strongest case is the document case is a buffoon. None of these cases are strong. The problem is all but one are in Democrat strongholds with Democrat juries. Many of the people on these juries won't give a damn what charges are brought against Trump. They just want something to be used against him. Now, that's the thumbnail sketch. I want to move to Manhattan quickly. It's a little more complicated, and it's equally a clown show. The charges brought against Donald Trump, first of all, the so-called facts were looked at by Cyrus Vance, a left-wing Democrat whose father worked for Jimmy Carter as Secretary of State. He's an elected Democrat. He chose not to run again, so Alvin Bragg ran, and he won. They were looked at by Vance, and he turned the case down. They were looked at by the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Southern District of New York. They turned down the case. Bragg originally turned down the case, except two Democrats working for a white-collar big law firm in New York. They stepped aside from their multi-million-dollar practices to join Alvin Bragg, and they concocted a case against Donald Trump for which they should be disbarred. But, of course, it's New York. They won't be disbarred. They'll probably be promoted to the appellate courts or whatever there. What's it about? You keep hearing the phrase hush money thrown around. This isn't a hush money case. They're called non-disclosure agreements. Every news organization that is calling this hush money has entered into hush money agreements, non-disclosure agreements with individuals who separate from the corporation. Some of them separate with a cloud over their heads. Some of them separate just because they're not doing their job. Some of them separate just because they're doing a reduction in force. And some of them separate because they want to get the hell out. There's 1,000 different reasons. And so it's typical, the HR department and the lawyers in a corporation, they look at it and they say, okay, and we'll give you a severance, but in exchange for a severance, you're not allowed to trash the company. Every media corporation in America has entered into non-disclosure agreements. Every single one of them. CNN, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, NBC, New York Times, Washington Post, every single one of them. They wouldn't say, no, these aren't hush money agreements. They're non-disclosure agreements. And they'd be right. But in Trump's case, we got to make it sound very evil. Hush money. Hush money. Oh. Now, so what's going on here? So we have non-disclosure agreements with two women. And apparently they're paid for at one of the Trump corporations. It's perfectly legal. But then Bragg has a problem. He says, well, they didn't really disclose them properly, and you're not allowed to use corporate money for these purposes, which, of course, you are. Ask CNN. Ask MSNBC. Ask any broadcast corporation. Ask any corporation in America. Ask Disney. Ask the woke ones. But what's he going to do? He's going to charge the former president with a misdemeanor? If you charge the former president with a misdemeanor, it's honestly not a big deal. But the former DA, Cyrus Vance, and the U.S. Attorney's Office said, this is ridiculous. We're not going to get into this stuff. People do this all the time, and it's perfectly legal and legitimate. So Bragg and his two hotshot, low-life, ambulance-chasing, slip-and-fall lawyers, they said, we have a better idea. What's that? Under New York law, if we can show that this misdemeanor occurred in furtherance of a felony somewhere, we can charge the president with a felony. Well, what felony? What are you talking about? What felony? And by the way, it could even be a federal felony. No. You're the local DA. We can give it a shot. Well, what is it? So they dust off the charges that Jack Smith brought against John Edwards in North Carolina, where Jack Smith took the federal election code and twisted it inside out and upside down, just as he does the Constitution with his arguments with the Klan Act, the Enron Act, the Federal Contractors Act, and applies them against Trump for January 6th. See, here's the point, and I'll finish this other point in a second. Every charge that's been brought against Donald Trump is utterly and completely illegitimate. Utterly and completely ridiculous. RICO statute in Georgia? Because you have a second set of electors. We had a second set of electors in 1876. If I have time, I'll get into that. I've done it before. But Manhattan. So what they're saying here is that Donald Trump used corporate money as an illegal, felonious campaign contribution to hide his illicit affairs with these two women so that it wouldn't be viewed as negative during the course of his campaign. It's an illegal corporate contribution. Do you believe that, Mr. Medusa?